So, what are some examples of this?
Network. People who want to work at Symantec, Kaspersky, or anything that are like related to like cybersecurity programs.
So yeah, there is testing in the certain sort. And who runs the tests?
Company. Head.
Who?
The head.
Say it again.
The head.
The head of what?
Head of administrator, or like the head of the department.
So, is anyone noticing a difference here, though, between the sorts of tests we're talking about here and the ones in the case of medicine? Who's running the tests in these cyber cases, the IT cases, very often?
The head, I believe.
The head of what, though?
The head of the company.
The department, which department?
IT.
Who is in charge of IT? Here's the big difference. If I am working in a hospital, and I'm a doctor, and I'm taking the board, who's in charge of deciding whether I'm passing the board? Who pays that person? Is it my company? No.
Definitely not.
If I'm in IT,
The company that you want to work in.
the company I want to work for is the one making sure I'm behaving well. What's the obvious worry here? Who is Google most worried about? Google. Google's #1 concern is Google.
Or Larry Page.
Facebook. Who's Mark Zuckerberg's #1 concern? Mark Zuckerberg.
Mark Zuckerberg himself.
Yeah, and so here's the thing. There's testing and certification, but it's another yes, but. Because while you're being tested and certified, the people in charge of making sure whether you're testing and certified are not necessarily an independent board. So, if you are, say you're being sued by somebody, who do you want on the jury? Do you want the person who's suing you? No, because they have a very vested interest. In the same way, you want an independent board looking down to make sure that you're behaving well. And in a lot of cases, and even saying yes, but is kind of strong. It's more of a So there's this, yes, you get tested, but it's from within the person you're working for. There's not a general nationwide sort of thing in the way that there is for doctors. And with doctors, there are like worldwide laws that you have to follow. And if you do not follow these practices, you are not allowed to practice medicine anymore. So one of them is that if you're a doctor and somebody comes in on your table, do you have to try to fix them? Or can you just be like, whatever, I don't especially like this guy? You have to. It doesn't matter who it is. If they brought Hitler back from the dead and he was sick and put him on your table, you legally have to work on this person regardless of who it is. You have no choice. Even if you think, I should just let this person die, you legally are not allowed to if you are a doctor, and you will lose your license. That sort of case that sort of oversight body of just coming along and saying, no, you're no longer allowed to do that. So here's another thing. If you do something, say you're working for Google, and you do something that Google's not too happy about, they fire you. What can you do now?
Get another job.
Get another job. You can just go and call up Apple and be like, hey, Google fired me. Can I work for you now? It doesn't work like that with doctors. If you lose your medical license in the United States, you can't just move to another country. If you get fired from one hospital for, killing a patient and you lose your medical license, you can't just go to a different hospital. It's very different in the cyber IT world, where to some degree there is this, but it's much less strictly governed. And then on top of this, are there government bodies? There are. But again, it's a yes, but sort of thing. Because if you do something that's kind of morally questionable as a programmer, and you get fired for it, it's not like there's now a governing body who has the power to go, and you will never work in this field again. If you're a doctor or a lawyer and you screw up, somebody has the power to say, and you will never work in this field again. If you screw up at Google, all you got to do is convince some other company to hire you. Or you can start your own company. And because of the nature of the internet and how complicated it is, if you did something kind of questionable at Google, the average person might not know that what you did or even understand it. If you're a doctor and you screw up, the average person at the very least knows, like, oh, a patient died, I know what that means. If somebody says, oh, this person did this, this, and this, and it left a back door into this, your grandmother shut off about 5 minutes ago. She doesn't understand. And so that's a major issue with this, is we have this field where nuclear reactors are being run by computers, which were designed by programmers, who are mainly being run on codes of conduct, internal testing, loose governing bodies that don't have the power to actually prevent you from ever working again, laws which were designed for horses, and the internal sense of morality. And so the big issue here is it's been like this with any sort of new profession when it comes along. When in the Industrial Revolution, what was it, 1800s, what happened? Anyone know? No.
There was a movement from agricultural lifestyle. You know.
It was basically in the 1800s, somebody, based on like new inventions like coal power and things, discovered, oh, you know what would allow us to make a lot more money? If we moved everyone into a giant factory and had everything done there, instead of people just making their own clothes at home. I can make a lot more money if I just start making it in bulk. And when this first started, work conditions, because there was no oversight, were terrible. So you read about things like children were allowed to work. And not only were children allowed to work, they were preferred because they were small enough to fit between the machines where there was no guardrails or protections or anything like that. And you had children working, like 6-year-olds working 18-hour days, sneaking between giant machines that if they touched them, they would lose arms. And so why was this able to get off the ground and start working like this? Well, because it was so brand new, no one had realized, oh, this is terrible, we need to put laws in place. Which is kind of where we are currently with computers. Who was in charge of deciding? The companies themselves. And then over time, laws came in. And so right now, we're at that same place of, we have all this new power, which is changing even faster than in older times. Like, the computer's changing much more quickly than the cotton gin did. And so now we are still, though, trying to catch up. And what we're talking about here is, given what exists and what professional ethics is and why it's so important, how do we deal with the fact that there's not really testing or governing bodies? And now what we're going to do, how are we doing on time? So we've gone an hour. So let's talk about codes of conduct, and then we will take our break. So basically what I'm going to say is, these testing ones and the government ones, they exist, but to such a limited degree that in a lot of ways, they don't function anything like the other cases do. And we're not anywhere near these being fully operable to make sure that people behave well. And most of the time with those tests, like to get a job, they're very much more concerned about whether you know how to program than whether you know how to program ethically. Like, they're much more concerned of can this person do a job for us? Can they make sure that this program runs? Not can they make sure that this program runs in such a way that no one 5 years from now is going to be able to hack into it. It's much more of a get it out, churn it out. And so that's, the average person may want your banking app to come out a year from now, but have no chance of being hacked. But if you're a company who's trying to compete against another company, you might just want to get it out as quickly as possible. So that's another issue with the testing one, is internal testing. The impulses that lead people to do internal testing are not necessarily the same as the people who are, running an independent board. And then laws, we'll be coming back to this a lot more later in the semester. For now, though, internal codes of conduct are basically the closest thing to guidelines that a lot of these jobs entail. So what do we mean by a code of conduct? We said it's the thing you sign at the beginning. Well, first off, is everyone on board with why the computing profession is at a different place than something like a doctor, even though the stakes are just as high, and why it's like a kind of concerning situation in a lot of ways? All right, so when we're talking about codes of conduct, what on earth are we talking about? What sorts of things do they say? Why are they there? How are they designed to work, etc.? And then we're also going to talk about why these things are imperfect, even though they're better than nothing. To be clear, we'll be talking about problems. The world is better when there are codes of conduct. That is no doubt. But the issue is the world is by no means perfect or necessarily even good if all we're relying on are codes of conduct. So what do we mean by codes of conduct? Well, they're those things you sign. What sorts of things do they say?
Behavior.
Yeah, so it's all about how you behave as an employee for that company. And so what are some of the guidelines you might come across in a computing code of conduct? Anything? Things like, so there are these various governing bodies which have a bunch of letters smushed together. And they include things like respect the privacy of your clients. They also include things like
the distinction between doing harm and doing.
Yeah, a lot of them say don't do things which harm society, or don't actively harm people, or strive to better society with your work. So like, better society. Don't do harm. See, the textbook has a whole bunch of, let's see.
It's in a 106 page.
Thank you. Yeah. So, not purpose. Here we go. Yeah, so they include things like be honest. So don't lie to your consumers. If you are doing something that's putting them in harm, don't lie to them. So, be honest. Anyone with the textbook in front of them who wants to let me take a drink of water, want to shout some of them out? It's on page 106.
Respect the privacy of others.
Yeah, so we got respect the privacy of your client/others. Better society, don't do harm, be honest. Reject bribery is another one. So these are all sorts of things that, this is how they're written. And what's the purpose of having down on a piece of paper all of these things? Why on earth, if you are a company, do you make one of these things? Or why should we want companies to make these sorts of things and make all their employees sign them? What are the...
Because you don't want to reach the, conclusion by yourself. You want, some general rules for everyone, so you don't...
So part of it is just, a company is going to be more ethical on the whole if you tell people at the start what is expected and what isn't. So part of it is just you just educate people on what, if you are a new computer professional, you might not know the sorts of harm that, you might understand the programming really well, but unless you are in the field and you understand how the politics and things work, you might not understand what sorts of things are acceptable to talk to other people about, and what you just have to keep your mouth shut about. You can probably talk about your fantasy football league that you're in with your coworkers, but if you start talking about what you're trying to design at a party, what if there's a competitor there? What if there's a competitor who, you're now threatening yourself and your coworkers with the possibility that a different company jumps on board, things like this. So these are the sorts of things you need to educate people about what's acceptable.
I think the educating to inform is important, but also to, like I said earlier, to hold people accountable.
Yeah, so another big thing is accountability and punishment. There's something very weird about punishing people for things they don't actually know are wrong. So if you don't know that something's and you hear about things like this in cross-cultural interactions. So you go to a different place and they do things differently from you, and all of a sudden you're insulting someone without having any realization that you're insulting them. So has this ever happened to anybody where you've done something like this and you just feel terrible afterwards? But at the time you're just oh, I had no idea that this was wrong. So that sort of thing where you do something, and in a workplace, if you don't know something's wrong, it's really hard to make sure that people are, one, they have to know that it's there so they can do it, and then two, if you're going to tell them you cannot do that, you have to have told them beforehand they cannot do it. But if they know, then you can punish them and you have grounds to fire them. So if you have a company where very clearly it says in our company, everyone of any belief system, race, gender, whatever, must be treated equally and with respect, and then you have somebody running around using racial slurs all the time, you can go, you literally signed something which said you cannot use racial slurs, you're fired. if you never tell them this, they at the very least have the grounds to then try to sue you. But if they signed a piece of paper which said, you cannot do this in the workplace, then you have the grounds to fire them. So that's another big thing, is if you tell people you cannot accept bribes at the start, then if they start accepting bribes, you can kick them out of the company. If you have something that says respect people's privacy, then if that person goes home and starts telling their mom about something that somebody said at work today, then you have the grounds to fire them. And then another one is just to get people, like, so the book talks about inspiring. It's kind of a stupid way of putting it, pardon me, textbook, but the basic idea is you tell people what the workplace is going to be like and get everyone on the same page, and people care a lot more about work and are more willing to be on board with the general ethical principles and work towards the same goals in the same ways. There's just a general thing of we like people who have similar beliefs, or at least similar worldviews, or at least some general commonality with us. So if you tell everyone this is the sort of place we're working, these are the things we do, it also just makes the workplace a better place where people care about the workplace more. And when you care about your coworkers, you're far more likely to be nice to them and behave ethically and work together. So those are the sorts of things we're talking about with codes of conduct. So you've got these things that say, you know, behave this way, respect each other, do this, do that, etc. And this is the sort of thing which you, if you had taken the time to read the one for John Jay, you find in it. Things like how to treat fellow students, how to do this, policies, what happens if you break them, etc., etc. So is everyone on board with why these things exist and why they're here? Now, it's also pretty clear why they're important. Like if you have this thing, you can punish people and fire them. You can make sure that people are behaving better than they would if they didn't know that these things were there. But there's also some obvious sorts of issues with having a system in which codes of conduct are the only thing. So, what are some of the issues with having codes of conduct being people's like self-feelings of what's right and wrong, and having codes of conduct as the main things that govern IT professionals? What are some of the worries with them? Why are they not perfect?
It's kind of general.
Yeah, they're really, really, really general. What do you mean by respect the privacy of others? What happened recently to Amazon and Google and Apple? What news came out in the past few months about every single one of them?
They're collecting people's data.
They've been collecting people's data, specifically what sort of data? Pardon?
Personal data.
Yeah, so personal, there was a specific one. It wasn't just personal data, it was what? Here's what we're going to draw. I will draw all of them. See if you can guess what, oh, that's terrible. Let's see if you can guess what I'm drawing.
Battery.
Messages.
Oh.
This is Amazon.
Oh, is that Alexa?
Yeah,
Oh.
that's Alexa. That's a beautiful Alexa.
Alexa.
And Siri was doing the same thing, and Google Assistant was doing the same thing. What was happening?
Phenomenal.
But what specifically was
Like a
happening with
trend.
these things?
They were like running in the background.
Bingo! They were, so every one of these companies had a system in place designed to make sure that their assistants were running properly. And the way it worked is all times that you asked Siri or Alexa or Google Assistant anything, it was recorded, and sometimes you would be sent to a recording center. A recording center that was being governed by actual people who were sitting there listening to what was happening from your Siri or your Alexa and judging like, oh, like very reasonable sorts of things where you're like, oh, does this person mean to call Alexa right now? Or, oh, is the answer that Alexa gave them probably a response to their questions? The sorts of things which are pretty reasonable. What were the issues though? Was that a hand? Or was
Yeah,
that-
I was gonna say, if you go into your Google account settings, you could listen to every single thing you've asked Google, like it's saved.
Yeah, so here's another, they're saved. And like there's something about it just being saved which is creepy because somebody could access it. But the fact was nobody knew that these like recording centers were there. So this is a case of it's even worse than I'm suggesting, because not only is it that people were listening in real time, they also could go back and find it all because it has to be stored somewhere. But at the time, we had people, every time you called Siri, there was a chance that somebody in some call center somewhere was listening in. Now, what was Apple and Google and their responses to this? why was this still respecting people's privacy? First off, how many of you think this is respecting your privacy? What if I tell you that one of the most common issues that happened with Siri is that it kept turning on when people were having sex? And many, many people who were working in these call centers said, yeah, the most common issue we had is that Siri kept recording people having sex. Also things that were recorded were drug deals happening in real time. And the reason that these issues are, one, somebody discovered that for some reason Siri confuses the sound of a zipper zipping with her name. So that was one of the issues with why sex kept being recorded. And another issue was that sometimes the Apple Watch, Apple Watches that are connected to Siri, if you sometimes have a setting that if you lift your wrist up, it engages and turns Siri on. And other ones, there's a button on the side that if you press it, Siri turns on. And so you can imagine if one is engaged in sexual activities, how either of these things may have accidentally happened. And so people were just sitting in a call center, and they're like, oh, these people are now having sex and we're listening to it sitting here. How many of you now, knowing this is happening, feel your privacy was being respected?